Before this story begins, one thing is worth knowing. What you are about to hear is an inspiring story based on a true one. 33 years ago, on a night of snow, a young doctor sat down beside an incubator. Inside it lay a baby weighing 3 pounds 2 ounces. Too small, too early, in a county hospital that was never built to keep a child like that alive. The doctor stayed with him 3 nights running. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing back. The baby lived. He grew into a paramedic, a single father who runs into fires for a living. And he carried his mother's dying wish everywhere he went. Find the doctor who stayed, because she never got to thank him. Then came a January night, a snowstorm, a box truck, and a burning car. And here is the truth of it, plain and simple. The man who crawled through the shattered window and cut the old doctor free was the very child that doctor had once kept alive. 3 sleepless nights, with nothing but a wristwatch and his own 2 eyes. Neither of them knew it. The Lord said it plainly a long time ago. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. Matthew 25:40. On that road, in that snow, the least of these came back. One of them was counting. The other one was listening. The car was burning when engine 7 turned onto the grade. It was 4:40 in the morning, in the January of the present. Engine 7 had just backed into the station off an earlier run when the tones dropped again. Nobody groaned. Nobody had breath to spare for it. Captain Dupree called the details from the cab, and the bay doors rolled up on a world gone white and sideways. A box truck had lost the grade a mile above the harbor. It slid down through 2 lanes of unplowed road and pinned an old sedan against the guardrail. By the time Engine 7 crested the hill, the sedan was burning. The night smelled of diesel and scorched paint and snow. Snow hissed where it landed on the hot metal, small white sounds, thousands of them, as if the storm itself were trying to put the fire out, and failing. The crew fought the fire first, because that is the first rule of the trade. Foam over the engine, steam rolling off the wreck in sheets. Then they braced the frame so the car could not shift. Only then did the hydraulic spreader come off the truck and begin forcing the door. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes is a short time in a life, and a very long time inside a burning car. Sawyer Teague spent those 20 minutes with his head at the broken window. Inside, an old man sat pinned behind the steering column, the dash down on his knees, blood at his hairline. Awake. That was what Sawyer would remember afterward. Awake and calm, and looking at him without any panic at all. "Stay with me now," Sawyer said through the glass. "What's your name? Talk to me." The old man's lips moved. What came out was not a name. "1," he said. A breath. 2. He was counting. Counting what, Sawyer could not tell, and there was no time to ask. The spreader groaned. The door gave, inch by inch, and the old man kept counting, softer each time, until somewhere between one number and the next, he faded out. Cervical collar. Backboard. The ambulance doors swallowed him whole. His papers had burned with the car. So the report said what reports say. Male, approximately 70, identity unknown. John Doe. But one detail followed Sawyer home that night and would not leave him alone. One old leather boot, scorched black at the toe, still laced on the old man's foot when they pulled him out of the fire. Sawyer Teague was 33 years old, and his world was small, and he loved all of it. A 2-bedroom house 4 blocks up the hill from the station. A daughter named Winnie, who was 6. A job that got him out of bed at hours God had set aside for owls. His wife, Callie, had died when Winnie was 2. He carried that loss quietly, and he did not speak of it often. The morning after the fire, Winnie sat at the kitchen table working on a school paper, with her tongue between her teeth. "My dad is a paramedic," it was meant to say. What it said was, "My dad is a paramedic. He helps people on the worst day they ever have." "Close enough," Sawyer said, and meant it in every direction at once. His mother would have laughed at that spelling until she had to sit down. Lorna Teague had died last fall, 59 years old, worn out by a lifetime of hard, honest work. In her last week, she had pulled Sawyer down to her by the collar, the way she used to when he was small, and handed him the only inheritance she had. "You weighed 3 pounds and 2 ounces, she said. "The hospital couldn't keep something that small. You lived because a doctor stayed. 3 nights he stayed. I was young and broke and scared, and I never went back to thank him. Find him for me. Tell him what he made." Everything she left behind fit in a shoebox: a hairbrush, a church program, and his newborn discharge paper, gone soft as cloth at the folds. At the bottom of the page stood a doctor's signature, smudged long ago by water, a first initial maybe, then a stain where the last name used to be. Now and again somebody asked Sawyer why a man with a little girl at home ran toward the very thing everyone else runs away from. He never gave the long answer. But the long answer was simple. Once, before he was old enough to remember it, a stranger had stayed through the worst night of his life and had not left. And a man spends the rest of his days trying to be worthy of a gift like that. 33 years earlier, in another snowstorm, it had begun. The storm, 33 years back, came up the coast without a name and shut Harwick down by dark. At the county hospital, a 27-year-old cannery worker named Lorna Teague gave birth to a son 10 weeks early. He weighed 3 pounds and 2 ounces. The doctor on call said his chances were even, 50-50. He said it gently. It did not change the number. Harwick County Hospital had no newborn unit. It had 1 warming incubator, 1 monitor with a tired green line, and 1 plan for a night like this. Call the city and let a neonatal transfer team carry the baby south to the machines and the specialists. That night, the plan met the storm and lost. Nothing was flying. Nothing was driving. The phone at the nurse's station kept promising morning, maybe, if the plows got through. And behind the glass, a chest the size of a man's palm went on lifting and falling, fighting for every breath. Dr. Gideon Ames was 33 that winter, 5 years into practice. A town pediatrician, the kind of doctor half the county quietly owed for one thing or another. He was not a specialist, and he knew it. He stood over the incubator for a long moment. Then he unbuckled his wristwatch and laid it face up on the table, where the second hand caught the light. "Somebody has to stay. Tonight, it is me." He said it to the charge nurse, the way a man says he will take the night shift at the mill. Then he sat down and began to count the baby's breaths, minute after minute, all night long, his lips moving over the numbers. 1, 2. Remember that counting. 33 years later, pinned in a burning car while snow came through a shattered window, the same man would slide down into the dark, still counting. Some things are more than habit. They are the shape a whole life has taken. Lorna watched through the corridor glass, too weak to stand for long, standing anyway. She prayed one prayer, once. "Lord, keep my baby breathing, and keep that man awake." And the sound she would carry for the rest of her life was not the monitor and not the wind. It was leather boot heels on the corridor tile at 4 in the morning, going away, coming back, never stopping. There are people like that scattered through this world, people who stay the night for strangers and never say a word about it afterward. If you believe the world still needs people like that, A like and a subscribe help stories like this one keep being told. Now, back to the January snow. In the January of the present, the old man did not wake. The surgeons operated twice and came out with serious faces. To the nurses, they said weeks. In the hallway, they said it might be longer. He lay in intensive care under lights that never fully went dark, a machine breathing with him, a screen counting his heartbeats, a machine doing, tirelessly and without love, the very thing somebody once did with a wristwatch. The hospital tried to find his name. The car's plates had burned black. The registration had burned with the glove box. And no missing person call came in from anywhere in the county. A man of about 70, and nobody phoned. That fact sat wrong with everyone who passed his door. His belongings fit in one clear plastic bag. A ring of keys, an old wind-up wristwatch with a cracked face, still running because somebody had kept it wound for years, and the leather boots. Scorched, the right toe burned black and hard. Damaged, but not destroyed. A nurse set them under the window the way people set boots by a door, as if their owner would be needing them again. Sawyer came on the fourth day, off shift, snow on the shoulders of his coat. The job did not ask this of him. The job ends at the ambulance doors. Every man in the trade knows that rule. He came anyway. He sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed and told the sleeping man ordinary things. The plows, Winnie's spelling, the way the harbor froze in sections. If anyone had asked him why, the closest he could have come was this. A man who is counting should not have to reach the last number alone. And so a young man kept the night hours at the bedside of a stranger, never knowing that he was doing, breath for breath, the very thing that had once been done for him. The only written clue to the sleeping man's name lay folded in a shoebox 4 blocks from the station. Soft as cloth, smudged past reading. And nobody in Harwick knew it yet. 33 years earlier, 11 days after Sawyer Teague carried her son home in a borrowed car seat, she carried him back through the same doors with a fever that frightened her hands. Gideon Ames met her in the corridor. He had signed the discharge paper himself, and he knew, from long years in the trade, a hard truth. A rescue does not always stay rescued. The first night they brought the fever down with cool cloths and patience, and by dawn the boy slept. Gideon allowed himself coffee in a paper cup. By noon the fever had climbed back, a degree past where it started, and the small chest was working harder than a chest that size should ever have to work. He changed the medicine. He waited. The fever climbed anyway. So he did the only thing that had ever reliably worked. He pulled a chair to the bedside and stayed. 2 days and 2 nights. His wool coat for a blanket. Sleeping in stretches of 20 minutes with 2 fingers resting near the boy's ribs. The second night was the bad one. Twice the breathing went thin. Twice he steadied it before anyone in the corridor even knew. Near 4 in the morning, a young night nurse brought him coffee he had not asked for, and asked him why he never went home. He looked at the boy instead of her. Do the quiet work well, and one day the quiet work will knock on your door. She wrote that down on the back of a scheduling sheet. He never knew it. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke and stayed broken, and the boy took a full feeding, furious about it, which was exactly how Gideon liked his patients. Before he signed the second discharge paper, he did what he did with every hard night child. He said the name over to himself, slowly, until it settled into his memory beside the others. Teague, Sawyer Teague. Down the hall, a mother who owned nothing worth giving stood at a dark window, watching the snow, wondering how a person even begins to thank a man for a thing like this. In the January of the present, Sawyer Teague spent his mornings off learning how easily a town can lose its own past. The hospital where he was born did not really exist anymore. Decades back, the county hospital had merged into a bigger system and moved buildings. The old maternity records went into boxes, and somewhere between one roof and the next, the trail simply ended. A records clerk with kind eyes told him she had seen it happen before. Paper, she said, does not always survive a move. So he was left with what he had started with. A discharge paper, 33 years old, soft at the folds, with a signature smudged by water. His mother's thumb, or snow, or simply time. So that the last name could have been anything. And his mother's telling, repeated all through her last autumn. A pediatrician. Leather boots. The sound of boot heels on corridor tile at 4 a.m, 3 nights running, when nobody else in that building was walking anywhere. At the station, Deke Rowell watched him lay the paper flat on the table one more time. A doctor in leather boots, Deke said. Congratulations. You just described half the men in this state and both of my uncles. Sawyer laughed, because it was true, and because Deke meant it kindly. Then he folded the paper back into his wallet. But there was one question he never brought up at the table. Why had 33 years gone by without anybody finding anybody? He knew the answer. He had grown up inside the answer. His mother owned 2 good dresses and her own quiet dignity. And in her mind, a busy doctor's door was not a door you knocked on when the only thing you had to bring was a thank you. She was never ashamed of being poor. She was too proud to arrive with empty hands. So the smudge stayed a smudge, and the years covered the whole story, the way snow covers a road. All Sawyer wanted now was 1 hour, long enough to stand in front of an old man and say the sentence his mother never got to say. He had no idea how close that hour already was. 33 years earlier, a young doctor handed a healthy baby back to his mother and went back to his rounds. The years that followed were quiet ones. Nobody in Harwick thought of them as a story. They were simply the town. But the pieces were all there, for anyone who asked. A mother out on the shore road remembered the winter her little girl could not breathe, and a doctor who sat with them in the steam of the bathroom until sunrise, still in his coat. He billed her for 1 house call, and that spring he let her pay it in eggs. The pharmacist on Main Street remembered him too. The door swinging open in weather nobody else would cross a porch in, boots leaving snow melt on the floorboards, a man hand-carrying medicine samples to houses where the money had run out. And down at the harbor, on any working morning, men in their 30s and 40s, men who had once been small and feverish in his waiting room, lifted 2 fingers off their coffee cups as he passed. He nodded back. He knew every name. Nobody in Harwick found that unusual, least of all him. 38 winters went by like that. Then Nell, his wife, died, 4 years back, between one autumn and the next. And the house on the bluff went quiet, the way a house goes quiet when 1 coffee cup starts doing the work of 2. He kept one ritual, and he kept it the way other men keep religion. Tuesday mornings, early and dark in winter, he drove out to the breakwater and walked the whole length of it and back, boots on wet stone, the gray ocean beside him. Rain or snow, it made no difference. It never had. And it was on those walks that the question came, the one he never said out loud. After all those years of sitting up through other people's worst nights, had any of it mattered? Was any of it remembered? The one person who used to remember it with him was gone. The walks went on, the same every week. whatever he carried inside. In the January of the present, that same question lay in a hospital bed, with 66 years of him still waiting for an answer. And the answer had been sitting beside his bed for days, in the shape of a young paramedic with an old folded paper in his wallet. By the start of the second week, the John Doe in the corner room was nobody's John Doe. He came up slowly, over days, the way a man comes up from deep water. And when his voice finally worked, the first thing he asked the day nurse about was not his chart. "Somebody tell me my boots made it," he said. There were 2 of them. I would settle for the survivor. The whiteboard by his bed finally got a name. Gideon Ames. The name reached Engine 7 with the rest of the shift news, and it meant nothing to Sawyer Teague. It could not have. The signature on his paper had been smudged for 33 years, and his mother, in all her tellings, had never once used a name. To Lorna, he had simply been the doctor, the one who stayed. As if a name were a smaller thing than what the man had done. Sawyer went up anyway, off shift, the way he had gone up all week. This time he brought Winnie, 6 years old and solemn about hospitals, carrying a paper cup of cocoa with both hands. "You're the one who cut me out of the car," Gideon said. His voice still had gravel in it. "I would get up and shake your hand, but my doctors are cowards." Winnie studied him a long moment. The tubes, the blanket, the snow light lying across the bed. "Were you scared?" "I was," Gideon said, "right up until a young fella crawled through my window and told me to stay awake. After that, being scared was his job." Winnie nodded, satisfied. Sawyer laughed and stayed an hour past the hour he had meant to. They talked about nothing at all. Roads, winters, the sorry state of the coffee. An old man and a young one, 33 years between them, each quietly deciding that he liked the other. Neither one knowing what they already were to each other. Outside, the snow kept falling on Harwick, quietly covering the town and the truth along with it. Sawyer came by on the last evening of visiting hours, alone, his coat still carrying the cold of the engine bay. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down the way men sit when they have made a decision on the drive over. "Can I ask you something that isn't medical?" "Those are the only questions worth answering." Sawyer took out his wallet. From behind the photographs, he drew a folded paper, soft as cloth at the creases, and opened it with both hands. A hospital discharge sheet, 33 years old. An infant's weight typed in a faded column. 3 pounds, 2 ounces. And at the bottom, a doctor's signature, drowned long ago under a ring of water. "My mother died last fall," Sawyer said. "The last thing she asked of me wasn't for herself. She said a doctor stayed 3 nights with me when I was born too early, through a storm, when nobody could get me to the city. She never got to thank him. She wanted me to find him." He laid the paper on the blanket. "You've been at that hospital your whole life. I keep thinking a man in the trade might know who he was." Gideon picked up the sheet. Teague. The name went through him like cold water. The storm. The tiny chest he had counted over, breath by breath, for 3 nights, until counting was the only language left in the building. A doctor forgets 1,000 easy names. The hard night names never leave him. His hand went still on the paper. He could have said it right then. 3 words. It was me. And the young man's search was over. But he knew what those words would cost. A kindness spoken of out loud stops being a gift and starts being a debt. And this good young man would spend the rest of his life trying to repay something that had never been for sale. Lorna had understood that. Maybe that was why she had waited a whole lifetime herself. He folded the sheet along its old creases and handed it back. Whoever he was, he got the better end of those 3 nights. That's a strange way to put it. Old men are entitled to a certain amount of strangeness. It's the last privilege the trade offers. When Sawyer had gone, Gideon lay looking at the ceiling for a while. Then he rang for the nurse and asked how soon a reasonably stubborn man could sign himself out of this bed. He had decided that the kindest thing left in his power was to quietly disappear from the young man's search. And he meant to do it well. They discharged him on a Thursday into a gray afternoon with more snow promised. He went home, slept 12 hours, and woke up with his mind already made, because he had lived by one rule his whole life. A crew that cuts you out of a burning car does not get a thank you card. It gets fed. So the next evening, a taxi let him off at Engine 7 with a covered roasting pan, 2 loaves of bread, and a store-bought pie he would take no questions about. Marisol, a nurse from the emergency ward, came along, carrying a box she had not explained. At the station door, she set it down and opened it. His old leather boots. The scorched one resoled. Both of them polished to a working shine. "A man wants his own boots," was all she said. He put them on in the doorway, like a man stepping back into his own name. The right toe still carried its scar, buffed dark, the way old scars are. The crew ate the way working men eat. Nothing left over, no speeches, until Captain Dupree lifted his mug. "To Doc Ames, sewed my chin shut the winter I was 9. Sled, mailbox, 11 stitches. I never even cried till it was over." "You cried well before it," Gideon said, and the table went up in laughter. Sawyer rose to fetch another chair from the ready room. He was halfway back across the apparatus bay when he heard it. Leather heels on concrete. Unhurried. Even. A steady knock, like a slow clock walking. Behind him, Gideon was crossing the bay toward the coffee urn, the old boot heels keeping their even time on the painted floor. And his mother's voice rose up out of last autumn, word for word. 3 nights, and the sound of that man's boots in the hallway was the only clock I trusted. Sawyer stood in the middle of the bay with a chair in his hands, and for the length of 10 steps he did not move. Then he set the chair down at the table, took the folded paper from his wallet, and came back holding it. The talk died on its own when Sawyer laid the old discharge sheet on the table, among the bread and the emptied plates. "My mother used to say she could tell time by a doctor's boots in a hallway," he said. His voice was level, the way it stayed level on calls. "I just heard them cross that floor." He smoothed the paper flat and turned it toward Gideon. "Look at the signature one more time. Not in a hospital bed this time." Nobody at the table moved. The furnace ticked somewhere back of the lockers. Out on the county road, a plow went scraping past and faded, and still nobody moved. Gideon looked at the smudge for a long moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, took out his pen, and, saying nothing at all, signed his own name beside it, slow and even, the letters leaning the way the drowned letters leaned. His hand did not hurry. It had signed that name across 38 years of charts, and it signed it now the way it had signed it the first time. He turned the sheet around and slid it back across the table. 2 signatures, 33 years apart. They matched. "It was you." Sawyer's voice was barely sound at all. "A thank you said out loud turns a gift into a bill," Gideon said. "I wanted the boy to have it free, and the man after him." Sawyer looked down at the 2 names for a long time. "I didn't pull you out of that car because I owed you. I did it because long before I ever rode a truck, somebody taught this town that night is for staying. I've been living by that man's lesson my whole life. I just never knew his name." Dupree set his mug down without a sound. "My chin, Doc. 9 years old. I wasn't telling a story earlier. I just didn't know the rest of it." He looked slowly around the table. 3 of the hands that pulled you out of that car had been yours first. Marisol had not touched her coffee. "I was 6, she said. a fever they couldn't break, and a man in the hallway all night. And Lorna Teague used to tell it at the church suppers when I was a girl, how she prayed 3 nights at that nursery glass, and the Lord answered her with a man who wouldn't go home. Gideon sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the 3 of them, one face at a time. Whatever rose in his eyes, he held it where it was, and it did not fall. "Well," he said at last, "the pie is getting cold." They stood outside afterward, under the bay lights, just the 2 of them, while the crew washed dishes behind the glass. The snow had eased to almost nothing, a few flakes wandering down with no storm left behind them. Inside, Dupree was telling the chin story again, and it had already grown 2 stitches in the retelling. Gideon stood in his resoled boots and let it all settle. For 38 years, he had told young nurses to do the quiet work well. He had believed it his whole life without ever once seeing the proof. Now the proof was standing in front of him. The quiet work had knocked. It had simply taken 33 years to find the door. "She carried it hard," Sawyer said. "Not getting a thank you. I used to think she handed the job to me because she wanted it finished. And now? Now I think she finished it herself. She never got to say the words, so she paid it another way. She raised her son into a man who stays. It just took her whole life to deliver." Gideon looked at him for a long moment. The paramedic, the single father, the 3-pound, 2-ounce boy nobody had once been willing to promise. So this was what 3 sleepless nights had grown into. A man, a good one, standing easy in the thinning snow. "Same night next January," he said. "I'll bring the roast. A crew like this ought to get fed more than once." "Every January," Sawyer said. "Same table. We'll keep you a chair." They shook on it, bare hands in the cold, and neither of them said thank you. The word had finally grown too small for the thing it stood for. Spring came to Harwick the way it always did, grudgingly and then all at once. By the first Tuesday of April, the snow was gone from the breakwater, and the planks had dried silver in the sun. Gideon walked it early, as he always had, but not alone anymore. Sawyer jogged at his shoulder, cutting his stride in half to keep pace. Winnie rode ahead on her bicycle, weaving between the posts, calling back urgent reports concerning gulls. She was his patient now, his newest, and by a wide margin, his loudest. The old boots went knocking along the planks, resoled and polished, keeping the same steady time they had kept down 38 years of hospital hallways. Winnie circled back once and rode beside the old man a while, studying him with a 6-year-old's frank attention. Then she delivered her finding to her father, in the voice children use for settled facts. "He wears the loud boots, so you can hear the help coming." She pedaled on. And she was right, in the way children are right. Because that is the whole story, told simply. Kindness done quietly, in the dark, for a stranger, it is never wasted. It keeps its own time. And one day, when you need it most, it comes walking back. Somewhere back down your own years, somebody stayed a night for you. A nurse, a neighbor, a stranger who would not go home. Leave their name in the comments. I read every one.